Hello, I'm Jason Clark.
I'm Marshall Filio.
I'm Michael Grunspan.
This is G Up Kim.
I'm Brian Lapsovic.
In this presentation, we are going to be going over the introduction, we're going to talk about the preliminary research, the quantitative research, the qualitative research, and finally conclude our capstone presentation.
The proposed research project aims to report on the CPA unification. Our research tests if the unification has given the CPA governing body control over the supply of accountants entering the workforce. We also research on how the cultural and professional expectations of accountants have been affected. The purpose of this section is to conduct preliminary research to form a starting foundation for understanding the reasons why the amalgamation occurred and who was involved. The findings of this section will allow for a well-rounded understanding that can be applied in the evaluation of primary research in the qualitative section of this report. For the methodology, a branch of actor network theory known as Callan's theory of translation is used to develop a model to which our research in this section is structured. Written documents, including articles from CPA, CA, CMA, and CGA accounting magazines, published news articles, academic papers, and official merging reports are collected and analyzed. The use of multiple empirical sources that deal with the amalgamation process allow for cross-referencing of the information that is provided. The preliminary moment is the situation that enables actors to become aware that a change is necessary. In this context, the emergence of globalization, the blurring of traditional accounting duties, and the growing pressures to address the complex and costly regulatory frameworks were the driving forces that were present. The focal actors in this translation are the Canadian Institute of Chartered Accountants and the Institute of Certified Management Accountants. These focal actors came together to discuss the merging of accounting designations in Canada under the new banner of Chartered Professional Accountant.
The problematization stage consists of identifying an obligatory passage point and the actors involved. The obligatory passage point can be identified as a unification of the three Canadian accounting designations. This position is supported as the obligatory passage point, as all other actors must eventually accept the singular situation if the translation is to be deemed successful. The identified actors in this translation process are as follows: the Certified General Accountants Association of Canada, employers, general public, government, provincial CAs, CGAs, and CMAs, and lastly, students. A key point to note is in regards to the obligatory passage point is that the identified actors' needs do not need to be directly related to the passage point initially. However, the actors must come to accept the obligatory passage point as a necessary requirement to solve their problems. The main occurrence during the entrustment stage is the persuasion of the identified actors to conform to the obligatory passage point that was outlined by the focal actors. In the formal unification proposal titled Uniting the Canadian Accounting Profession, 8 overarching principles that would be met through the unification were outlined by the focal actors after engaging in consultation with members of the designation. The 8 principles are as follows: continued use of the existing designations, evolution to a new single designation, retention but no expansion of rights, qualification, merge operations and governance, focus on the CPA brand, post-qualification specialties, regulation, and licensing. The enrollment stage focuses on the identified actors evaluating how the obligatory passage point would satisfy their needs. The main forms of questioning to test if the unification would suit the personal needs of each actors comes from debates, meetings, and position papers. Highlighted concerns that were discussed through these mediums are as follows: the protection of legacy rights, retention of legacy designations, governance and fair representation, uniformly high and consistent ethical and practical practice standards, and a high standard of practice is maintained. Mobilization is the final stage of Callan's theory of translation. This stage can be understood as the identified actors conforming to the claim that the obligatory passage point is credible and indispensable. As of September 27, 2016, CPA Canada had announced that the unification process was essentially complete. At this time, all provinces and territories with the exception of Northwest Territories and Nunavut had proclaimed legislation in support of the unification. As a result of the majority of actors conforming to the obligatory passage point, the unification was considered indispensable, thus completing the translation process.
Our numerical research focused on 3 different areas: the graduating numbers of pre-amalgamation versus post-amalgamation. The second area of research focused on international comparisons between Canada and two selected different groups of countries. And the third section focused on salary data for Canada internally. The first area of research that we wanted to focus on was the number of graduates from the CPA program in the current day, comparing that number to the aggregate number of people graduating from the CA, CMA, and CGA programs prior to the amalgamation. If the number of CPAs graduating currently was lower than the combined number of the three prior designations prior to amalgamation, that would support our thesis. The information we sourced was from an arm's length organization of the government called the Fairness Commissioner of Ontario. We were only able to source data for Ontario. So the caveat here for our entire capstone is that we wanted to look into CPA Canada overall, but we could only source data on CPA Ontario and Ontario's pre-amalgamation numbers.
For the graduates over time to be seen, they have been aggregated into this bar graph here. As you can see, the CA in purple, CMA in orange, CGA in gray, and the aggregate total of the previous designations in yellow. When looking at the blue bars, which represent the current CPA graduates, it is easy to see that the number of CPA graduating now are less than the aggregate number of accountants graduating prior to the designation. One very important point to understand here is the outlier of 2015, where the CPA graduates far exceeded the number of aggregate accountants in the previous years. 2015 was the first year where all three designations were listed under one. Due to 2015 being the first year of the CPA designation, there would have been overlap from current students in their respective previous designation programs and the current graduating accountants. Due to the overlap and the other external factors of the amalgamation of the CPA, it can be determined that 2015 is an outlier, as the remaining sets of data depict common values of approximately 3,000 CPAs graduating per year. With less CPAs graduating per year after the amalgamation, this supports our thesis of the CPA amalgamation controlling the supply of accountants to the Canadian market.
The second area of numerical research that our group looked into was an international comparison, comparing the number of accountants in the Canadian workforce to the number of accountants in the workforces of similar countries. We divided the number of accountants in each country by the overall population to get a ratio to remove the effect of size. We didn't want to compare Canada to every other country in the world. We wanted to have meaningful comparisons. So we had two tiers of international comparisons. The first tier consists of countries that are heavily influenced by Great Britain, in other words, countries in the British Commonwealth, including the United States of America. We wanted to look at these countries because of similar political, legal, and institutional arrangements in the countries that make the economies of these countries very comparable and make the inferences meaningful. The second tier of countries that we looked into included the first tier of countries, but expanded that select group to include other Western European countries like France and Germany, and then some Asian countries like India, China, South Korea, and Japan. The methodology that our group wanted to employ in the international comparisons was if Canada's ratio was higher, in other words, if Canada has a higher ratio of accountants per capita than other select countries, this would support our thesis that Canada is oversaturated with accountants.
The first graph here depicts the total amount of professional accountants in each country as the benchmark to understand the professional accountants per capita. With the professional accountants per capita graph shown below, it can be seen that Canada has more accountants per its population than the other countries, other than Australia and New Zealand. The most important factor to pay attention to here is that the United States has 327.2 million people, whereas Canada only has 37.5 million people. Yet Canada is more saturated with accountants. This comparison strongly depicts the number of accountants in Canada and gives light to a reason that the supply of accountants may be needing to be limited, as our thesis states. Once again, when looking at the saturation of accountants in the market of these countries, Canada is still much more saturated than any other country other than Australia and New Zealand. UK and Ireland is more saturated accountant-wise than Canada, but this is due to the fact that the data found combined both the UK and Ireland. If these two countries were separated, their saturation of accountants would be lower than Canada. After analyzing these factors, it can be said without a doubt that Canada is oversaturated with accountants, and therefore something must be done to control the supply of accountants to the market.
The third and last area of focus for our numerical quantitative information was Canadian domestic salary information. We sourced all of this information from Stats Canada. The time period of censuses that we were able to source covered 1996 to 2016, which is a 20-year period. what we wanted to look at, our methodology in this section was we wanted to look at the growth in income for accounting professionals in the Canadian workforce and compare that to not only the Canadian workforce overall in aggregate, but to a select random sample of 4 other jobs in the Canadian workforce and then 2 specific professional jobs that our group selected.
Salary comparison is here. The main takeaway from this table is that the growth rate for the entirety of the Canadian workforce was 1.75. Meanwhile, both the accounting professional jobs exceeded the income growth rate compared to Canada. In addition to this, it can be seen that not only is the income growth rate for accountants greater than the Canadian workforce, it is also greater than 5 of the 6 jobs analyzed. This table depicts that with the decrease of supply in accountants into the workforce, the demand for the work was greater and therefore increased the salaries for the accountants across Canada.
For our qualitative data collection methods, the 2 methods were 1. Likert scale surveys with an open-ended concluding question, and 2. Semi-structured interviews. Our survey contained 9 brief questions about the CPA amalgamation, including an open-ended question about the pros and cons of the amalgamation. Each question had a 5-point Likert scale for the respondent, ranging from strongly disagree, disagree, neither agree nor disagree, agree to strongly agree. Our semi-structured interview also had 9 questions about the amalgamation. However, the researcher had freedom to ask additional questions, topical or tangential, to provide additional context to any of the respondents' answers. Our initial target sample sizes for survey responses were n equals 50, for interviews n equals 9, 3 for each legacy designation. Unfortunately, due to the unusual circumstances of COVID-19, we halted our survey and interview processes at the start of March, missing our target numbers. In the end, we can only collect 5 survey responses and conducted only 2 interviews. Based on all the qualitative data gathered, here is what we learned. There was a tiered system among the legacy designations. CAs were on top as their designation required the most education, requiring university education and a degree. Their traditional roles were in management and typically worked in public auditing. CMAs were in the middle of the tier system and typically worked in industry compared to public accounting. They performed tasks such as bookkeeping, compilation financial statements, and personal and corporate taxes, were typically in management roles but required a similar amount of education to CAs. CGAs were at the bottom, performing tasks similar to CMAs, which are bookkeeping, compilation financial statements, and taxes, but only requiring college-level prerequisites and typically were not in management roles. Overall, the public benefited from the unification as the merger streamlined and marketed chartered accountants as a unified professional resource that is available to the public. Prior to the merger, there was uncertainty in the differences between designations and which designation was right for the job. The CPA education incorporated aspects from all 3 designations, emphasizing soft skills such as management proficiency and group work experience, as well as accounting techniques and theory. The CPA unification effectively homogenized the perceivable differences between accountants from different designations by simultaneously lowering the ceiling between all 3 designations and raising the floor between them in terms of capability, education, experience, and marketability to the public.
In conclusion, namely globalization led to the unification of the 3 legacy designations to form a single accounting designation. Another key factor was the method of the focal actors in understanding the needs of actors before going forward with unifications. The quantitative findings assisted in strengthening our thesis statement. The most prevalent finding from the research is the number of graduated students from the current day CPA program, and that it is lower than the 3 pre-amalgamation designations combined. This is the most direct evidence to prove our thesis. Additionally, Canada is saturated with accountants in the analysis of the accountants per capita. Lastly, it was discovered that there were some who benefited from the amalgamation in the business environment and some that did not. Prior to the amalgamation, there was uncertainty in the differences between the designations. In addition to this, it was found that the CAs felt the drawbacks of the amalgamation as their education and career path were more difficult and now are mixed with the 2 legacy designations. Overall, through our research, it can be said that with the amalgamation of the CPA designation, they did in fact control the supply of accountants to the workforce in Canada, as well as it can also be concluded that there have been shifts in the expectations in the workforce due to this amalgamation. Thank you for listening to our capstone presentation.